All right. The Magic Prison. This is our second story this year. These are so much fun because these characters are imaginary, but they're learning lessons that maybe we could take a little bit of advice from. Okay, The Magic Prison by Elizabeth Harrison. Little Harweda was born a prince. His father was king over a great land, and his mother was the most beautiful queen that the world had ever seen. Prince Harweda was their only child. From the day of his birth, everything that love or money could do for him had been done. But his parents never thought of making the young prince care for anything but himself. He had never in all of his life given up one of his comforts that somebody else might have pleasure. So, of course, he grew up to be selfish. And by the time he was 5 years old, he was so very disagreeable that nobody loved him. I'm wondering if you're looking at vocab and context, what you might think the word disagreeable meant based on what was in the rest of the paragraph. Dear, oh dear, what shall we do? Said the poor queen mother, and the king only sighed and answered, ah, what indeed? They were both very much grieved at heart, for they well knew that little Harweda, although he was a prince, would never grow up to be a really great king unless he could make people love him. At last they decided to send for his fairy godmother and see if she could find a way to cure Prince Harweda of his thinking of nothing but himself. Well, 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 exclaimed the godmother when they had laid the case before her. This is a pretty state of affairs. And I, his godmother, too. Why wasn't I called sooner? She told them that she would have to think a day and a night and another day before she could offer them any help. But, she added, if I take the child in charge, you must promise not to meddle for a whole year. I'm wondering if you don't look down to the bottom, what could you guess the word meddle means based on that paragraph? And then go to the bottom of the page to check it out. The king and queen gladly promised that they would not speak to their son or even see him during that time. Ah, I think that's the answer to what that word meddle means. During that time, the fairy godmother would only cure him if the fairy godmother would only cure him of his selfishness. We will see about that, said the godmother, expecting to be a king someday and not caring for anyone but himself. A fine king he will make. With that, off she flew, and the king and queen saw nothing more of her for a day and a night and another day. And then she came back in a great hurry. Give me the prince, she said. I have his house all ready for him. 1 month from today, I will bring him back to you, and perhaps he will be cured, and perhaps he won't. If he's not cured, then I will have to try 2 months the next time. We shall see. Without more ado, she picked up the astonished young prince and flew away with him as lightly as if he were nothing but a feather or a straw. They flew a long distance until they reached a great forest. When they came to the middle of it, down flew the fairy. In a minute more, the young prince was standing in a green grass beside the beautiful pink marble palace that looked somewhat like a good-sized summer house. This is your new home, said the godmother. In it you will find everything you need, and you can do just as you choose with your time. Little Harweda was delighted at this, for there was nothing in the world he liked better than to do as he pleased. He tossed his cap up into the air and ran into the lovely little house without so much as saying thank you to his godmother. Uh-oh, do you think that's foreshadowing if he doesn't say thank you? Remember, foreshadowing is clues or hints about what might happen next. Huh, she said as she disappeared. You'll have enough of it before you are through, my fine prince. And away she flew. Maybe that's even stronger foreshadowing. Prince Harweda had no sooner set his foot inside the small rose-colored palace than the iron door shut with a bang and locked itself. For you must know by this time that it was an enchanted house, as of course all houses are that are built by fairies. His fairy godmother had told him that it was his house. Therefore, he was interested in looking at everything in it. From the middle of the ceiling hung a large gilded bird cage containing a beautiful bird, which just at this moment was singing a glad song of welcome to the prince. Harweda, however, cared very little about birds, so he took no notice of the songster. Wonderfully carved jars and vases, gold and silver, stood about the floor, and each was filled with a different kind of perfume. "This is delicious," said Prince Harweda. "Now I can have all the sweet odors I want without the trouble of going into the garden for my flowers." In the center of the room was a fountain of sparkling water, which leaped up and fell back into its marble basin with a faint, dreamy music, very pleasant to hear. On the table near at hand stood baskets of the most tempting pears and grapes and peaches, and near them were dishes of all kinds of sweetmeats. I wonder what a sweetmeat is. Don't look at the bottom and cheat. See if you can figure that out based on the paragraph. "Good," cried the greedy young prince. "That is what I like best of all." And he fell to eating fruit and sweetmeats as fast as he could cram them into his mouth. But strange to say, no sooner did he reach his hand out for a soft, mellow pear or a rich, juicy peach than another pear or peach took its place. Magic. After Prince Harweda had eaten until he could eat no more, he threw himself down on one of the couches and soon fell asleep. When he awoke, he noticed for the first time the walls, which, by the way, were really the strangest part of his new home. They had in them 12 long checkered windows, which reached from the ceiling to the floor. So visualize that. Think in your head what that must look like. The spaces between the windows were filled with mirrors exactly the same size as the windows, so that the whole room was walled in with windows and mirrors. But the little Prince Harweda scarcely glanced out of the windows at all. He was so taken up with his broad, handsome mirrors, for in each of them he could see himself, and he was very fond of gazing at his reflection. He was much pleased when he noticed that the mirrors were so arranged that he could see himself in several of them at the same time. He could thus see his front and his back, and each side altogether, as he was a handsome boy, and he enjoyed the many views of himself immensely. He spent much time gazing into the wonderful mirrors that he had very little use for the books and games that had been placed in there for him. He spent hours each day before the first mirror and then before first one mirror and then another. And then he did not notice that the windows were growing narrower and the mirrors wider. The windows had become so small they hardly admitted light enough for him to see himself in the mirrors. So without looking at the bottom, see if you can guess by the context of this paragraph, what does it mean? What does this word admitted mean? That's practicing vocabulary and context. Still, this did not alarm him very much, as he cared nothing whatsoever for the outside world. The windows at last became mere slits in the wall, and the mirrors grew so large that they reflected not only little Harweda, but all of the room besides in a dim kind of way. What does the word dim mean? If the windows are closing, what do you think dim means? Finally, however, Prince Harweda awoke in the morning and found himself in total darkness. What? Not a ray of light came in from the outside, and of course, not an object in the room could be seen. He rubbed his eyes and sat up to make sure that he was not dreaming, and then he called loudly to someone to open a window for him, but no one came. He got up and he felt his way to the iron door and tried to open it, but as you know, it was locked. He kicked it and beat upon it, but he only bruised his fists and hurt his toes. He grew quite angry now. How dare anyone shut him, a prince, into a dark prison like this? He cried out against his very godmother, calling her all sorts of horrid names. Horrid must not be anything good, right? And then he blamed his mother and father. In fact, he blamed everybody and everything except himself. But it was of no use. The sound of his own voice was his only answer. The whole of the outside world seemed to have forgotten him. As he felt his way back to the couch and knocked over one of the golden jars that held the liquid perfume, the odor was gone now, and only an empty jar rolled across the floor. He laid himself down on the couch, but the soft pillows had been removed and an iron framework received him. So not only is it dark, but the stuff from the room that made him comfortable is disappearing. He was dismayed. How do you think he felt? What are some other words you could use instead of dismayed? He was dismayed, and he lay for a long time trying to think that he had what he had best do with himself. All before him was blank darkness, as black as the darkest night you ever saw. He reached out his hand to get some fruit and eat, but only one or two withered apples remained on the table. Was he to starve to death? Suddenly he noticed the tinkling music of a fountain had ceased. He hastily felt his way over to it, and he found a place of the dancing, running stream, a silent pool of water. A hush had fallen upon everything around him. A dead silence was in the room. He threw himself down on the floor and wished that he were dead too. So here they're using very strong words to describe his emotions, right? At last, he heard or thought he heard a faint sound. He listened eagerly. It seemed as if some tiny creature not far from him was trying to move about. For the first time in nearly a month, he remembered a bird in its gilded cage. Gilded, golden. Poor little thing, he cried as he sprung up. You too are shut within this terrible prison. This thick darkness must be as hard for you to bear as it is for me. Here, is he thinking only of himself, or is he starting to think about others? This may be the climax of the story. And we'll talk about that in class, about the plot line. The climax is where everything begins to change. He went toward the cage as he came near, the bird gave a sad little chirp. You must need some water to drink, poor thing, he said, filling its drinking cup. This is all I have to give you. And then he heard a harsh, grating sound as if a rusty bolts sliding with difficulty out of their sockets, and then a faint ray of light, not whiter than hair, began to shine between the heavy mirrors. Prince Harweda was filled with joy. So he's thinking about someone else and what is happening to his prison. Perhaps, he said softly, I may see the light again. Ah, how beautiful the outside world would look to me now. The next day he was so hungry that he began to eat one of the old withered apples. And as he bit, he thought of his fellow prisoner. You must be hungry too, poor thing, he said, putting a part of his apple in the bird's cage. Again came the harsh grating sound, and the boy noticed that the cracks of light were growing larger still. They were only cracks. Nothing of the outside world could be seen, but it was comfort not to have to feel this way about total darkness. Prince Harweda went up to one of the cracks and, putting his eye close to it, as if he would to a pinhole in a paper, was glad to find that he could tell the greenness of the grass and the blue of the sky. He then climbed up into a chair and unfastened the bird cage from the golden chain by which it hung. He carried it carefully into the nearest crack of light and placed it close to the narrow opening. It was once more he heard the harsh grating sound, and the wall moved a bit. The windows were now at least an inch wide. At this, the poor prince clasped his hands with delight. He sat down near the bird cage and gazed out of the narrow opening. Never before had the trees looked so tall and stately, or the white clouds floating through the sky so lovely. So without looking at the bottom, see if you can guess what the word stately means, and then check it. That's vocabulary in context, remember? The next day, he was carefully cleaning the bird's cage. The walls again creaked and groaned, and the mirrors grew narrower as the windows widened. But Prince Harweda saw only the flood of sunshine that poured in and the beauty of the larger landscape. He cared nothing whatever now for those stupid mirrors, which only could reflect what he had placed before them. One day, as two white doves suddenly soared aloft in the blue sky, the poor little bird, who had now become the prince's comrade, gave a pitiful little trill. Now I want you to visualize what's going on. The windows are opening and the sky is visible. What is he going to do next? Imagine this in your mind. Dear little fellow, cried Prince Harweda, do you also long for your freedom? You shall at least be as free as I am. So saying, he opened the cage door and the bird flew out. Soon one day after this, the little bird fluttered up against the window pane and beat its wings against it in a vain effort to get out. A new idea seized the young prince. He took up the golden jar, went to the window, and struck one of the checkered panes of glass with all of his force. You shall be free, even if I cannot be, he said to the bird. 2 or 3 strong blows shivered the small pane, and the bird swept out into the free air beyond. Ah, my pretty one, how glad I am that you are free at last, cried the prince, watching the flight of his little fellow prisoner. His face was bright and glad, unselfish joy. The small pink marble palace shook from the top to the bottom. The iron door flew open and the fresh wind from the sea rushed in. Prince Harweda could hardly believe his eyes, and he sprang to the door. There stood his fairy godmother, smiling with her hands stretched out toward him. Come, my godchild, she said gently, we will go back to your father and mother, the king and queen. Great indeed was the rejoicing of the palace when the Prince Harweda was returning to them, a changed boy, kind and thoughtful to all of those around him. Many a struggle he had with himself in his old habit of selfishness, but as time passed by, he grew to be a great and wise king, tenderly caring for all of his people and loved by them in return. The end. So I want you to think about this story. There's 2 kinds of prisons described in this story. There's one that's the physical prison that Prince Harweda was put in by his fairy godmother. I wonder if there's another kind of prison that Prince Harweda was in, but he didn't know it. Think about that, and we'll talk about it in class.